The moment you first encounter the image, it does not behave like an ordinary picture. It does not announce itself clearly, nor does it immediately reveal its meaning. Instead, it lingers at the edge of perception, faint yet disturbingly precise, as if it exists halfway between presence and absence. The cloth appears ancient, fragile, marked by centuries of handling and devotion, but the figure imprinted upon it feels timeless, as though it does not belong to any single era. This is why, for generations, the Shroud of Turin has refused to be dismissed. Not as a painting, not as a medieval trick, not as a simple relic. It persists because it does something no painting should be able to do. For centuries, observers believed that the image was painted. This assumption felt natural. Human beings have always explained mysterious images by attributing them to artistic intent. Yet as science advanced, the explanation of paint began to crumble under scrutiny. Pigments were expected, brushstrokes were expected, binding agents, residues, or traces of technique were expected. But what researchers found instead was an absence so complete that it became more unsettling than any presence could have been. No paint, no dye, no pigment, no artistic medium. The image was there, yet nothing that should have created it was. This absence is the starting point of the mystery. The cloth bears the front and back image of a man who appears to have been crucified. The wounds correspond with remarkable anatomical precision to the injuries described in Roman executions. Puncture wounds on the wrists rather than the palms, marks on the feet, consistent with a single nail. Scourge marks covering the body from a Roman flagrum. A wound in the side consistent with a spear and a head marked with punctures, as if from a crown of thorns. Bloodstains are present. But the image itself is not made of blood. The blood came first, the image came later, and that detail alone challenges nearly every artistic explanation ever proposed. Paintings do not behave this way. Artists work from the outside inward, layering pigment onto fabric or surface. Here, the blood appears beneath the image. The image does not seep into the fibers like paint. It exists only on the outermost fibrils of the linen threads, affecting them to a depth of only a few microns. No known painting technique, ancient or modern, produces this effect. Even today, with lasers and advanced imaging systems, replicating this precise superficiality remains extraordinarily difficult. The image itself is also strange in its tonal behavior. Up close, it dissolves into meaningless discolorations. Step back, and a lifelike human form emerges. But there is something even more peculiar. When the image is processed through a three-dimensional analyzer, it encodes depth information. Brighter areas correspond to closer parts of the body. Darker areas correspond to parts farther away. In other words, the image behaves like a topographical map of a human form. Paintings do not do this. Photographs do not naturally do this. But the shroud does. This discovery, first made in the 1970s when the image was analyzed using NASA-developed image processing technology, stunned researchers. The shroud was never intended to be viewed as a three-dimensional object. Yet it contained information that only makes sense in 3 dimensions. If the image had been painted, the depth data would be random. Instead, it was mathematically coherent. The cloth appeared to record distance, as if the body had somehow interacted with it in a way that encoded spatial information directly into the linen. This raised a terrifying question. If the image was not painted, then how was it formed? For centuries, theories multiplied. Some suggested scorching from heat. Others proposed chemical reactions from decomposition gases. Still others imagined clever medieval forgeries using unknown techniques. Yet one by one, these theories failed to account for the full range of observed properties. Heat would have damaged the fibers more deeply and left telltale signs. Chemical reactions would not produce anatomical precision or consistent three-dimensional encoding. Forgery theories collapsed under the sheer number of variables that would have needed to be anticipated centuries before modern science could even measure them. What remained was not an explanation, but a void. And into that void stepped modern science. In 1978, a team of over 30 scientists from various disciplines formed the Shroud of Turin research project, known as STURP. Their mandate was not theological, it was empirical. They were given unprecedented access to the cloth, armed with the best technology of their time: spectroscopy, microscopy, X-ray fluorescence, ultraviolet imaging, and chemical analysis. They worked day and night, documenting every measurable aspect of the image. Their conclusion was both cautious and explosive. The image was not the result of paint, pigment, dye, or stain. No artist technique known to history could account for it. The blood was real human blood, containing hemoglobin and serum separation visible under ultraviolet light. The image itself was caused by oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation of the cellulose fibers, limited to the outermost surfaces of the linen threads. In simple terms, the linen fibers had aged prematurely in specific areas, forming the image without any added substance. The question shifted again. What could cause such selective aging? The image had another disturbing characteristic. It contained no signs of decomposition. Bodies wrapped in cloths decompose quickly. Gases build up, fluids seep out. The cloth absorbs these products unevenly, yet the shroud shows none of this. The body seems to have vanished before decomposition could begin. The bloodstains remain undisturbed, with clear margins. as if the cloth was never peeled away from a decaying corpse. Instead, it appears the cloth and body separated without smearing the blood. This detail is rarely discussed outside scientific circles, yet it may be one of the most critical. If the image had been created by contact or chemical interaction with the body over time, decomposition artifacts would be unavoidable. Their absence suggests a short interaction, something brief yet powerful. Another overlooked feature lies in the directionality of the image. It is not flattened, as one would expect from a cloth wrapped tightly around a body. The image lacks side distortion. The nose is not smeared sideways. The cheeks are not flattened. The ears are not compressed. The image appears as if the cloth hovered above the body, recording it without lateral contact. This again defies ordinary physical processes. As these findings accumulated, the debate intensified. Skeptics pointed to radiocarbon dating performed in 1988, which placed the cloth between 1260 and 1390 AD. The announcement was explosive and widely publicized. Case closed, many declared. Medieval forgery, end of discussion. Yet science rarely ends so cleanly. The radiocarbon testing itself soon became controversial. Only a single area of the cloth was sampled, taken from a corner known to have been heavily handled and repaired after a medieval fire. Later, textile analysis suggested that this region may not be representative of the entire cloth. The possibility of contamination, invisible mending, or bioplastic coatings from centuries of exposure was raised. Multiple peer-reviewed papers challenged the statistical handling of the data. Other dating methods, including chemical and mechanical tests, produced results consistent with a much older origin. Suddenly, the certainty evaporated. The shroud returned to its familiar state, unresolved, contested, and profoundly unsettling. Yet the question of painting had already been answered. Whatever the cloth was, it was not painted. No artist, medieval or otherwise, had left their hand upon it. No pigments betrayed intention. No technique betrayed craftsmanship. If it was a forgery, it was one without an artist, and that alone strained credibility. The image also exhibits photographic negativity. When photographed and inverted, the image becomes startlingly lifelike. Light and shadow fall naturally. Facial features emerge with realism. This discovery, made in 1898, long before digital imaging, raised an uncomfortable implication. The image behaves like a negative photograph, yet photography would not be invented for another 6 centuries. A medieval artist could not have anticipated this effect. More importantly, no known painting method naturally produces a photographic negative. As science continued to probe the image, the explanations grew thinner. At some point, skepticism began to shift. The question was no longer whether the image could be explained easily. It was whether it could be explained at all, using known natural processes. This does not mean science proved a miracle. Science does not operate in that domain. But it does mean that science encountered a boundary. The shroud sits at the intersection of physics, chemistry, biology, and history, refusing to align neatly with any of them. Each discipline can describe what is present. None can fully explain how it came to be. And this is where the story becomes dangerous to dismiss too quickly. Because when an object resists explanation not because of lack of data, but despite an abundance of data, it demands humility, it demands patience, it demands that we remain open to possibilities beyond our assumptions. The shroud does not shout its meaning, it whispers. And in that whisper lies its power. The man on the cloth is not idealized. He is battered, broken, exhausted. His injuries are not symbolic. They are forensic. Blood flows from precise wounds. The posture suggests rigor mortis. The face is swollen. The body bears the marks of extreme trauma. This is not a triumphant figure. It is a suffering one. And yet paradoxically, the image itself is serene, almost restrained, as if violence has already passed. This duality unsettles both believer and skeptic. For believers, it challenges simplistic devotion. For skeptics, it challenges easy dismissal. The cloth offers no inscription, no signature, no explanation. It simply exists, carrying an image that should not exist. As technology advances, new tools are brought to bear. Yet each new test seems to reinforce the same conclusion. The image was not painted, it was not drawn, it was not dyed, it was not burned, it was not printed, it was not pressed. So what was it? That question remains unanswered. And perhaps that is why the shroud continues to endure. It does not conform to belief, nor does it surrender to disbelief. It occupies a space that modern culture finds deeply uncomfortable, mystery grounded in evidence. In a world increasingly confident in its explanations, the Shroud of Turin stands as a quiet contradiction. It reminds us that not everything ancient is primitive, that not everything unexplained is fraudulent, and that sometimes the most unsettling discoveries are not those that contradict faith, but those that refuse to be categorized at all. And as long as the image remains, faint yet indelible, the question will remain with it, waiting patiently for an answer that may never come. To understand why the image on the Shroud of Turin cannot be a painting, it is necessary to confront the physics of how images are normally formed. Every conventional image-making process, whether artistic or mechanical, relies on one of 3 mechanisms: deposition, penetration, or contact pressure. Pigments are deposited. Dyes penetrate fibers. Impressions rely on pressure or heat. The shroud image uses none of these. Instead, it exists as a chemical modification of the linen fibers themselves, restricted to their outermost molecular layers, without altering the inner structure of the threads. This distinction is crucial. Linen fibers are composed of cellulose, long chains of glucose molecules arranged in crystalline and amorphous regions. When linen ages naturally, oxidation and dehydration slowly alter these chains, causing a gradual yellowing. On the shroud, this same aging effect appears to have occurred instantly, selectively, and spatially encoded into the fabric. The fibers in the image area are chemically older than those outside it, yet no foreign substance accelerated this aging. The fibers themselves were changed. This eliminates an enormous range of hypotheses. Any liquid-based technique, whether paint, dye, or chemical wash, would have weakened into the threads through capillary action. The shroud image does not. Any heat-based process would have scorched the fibers more deeply and produced fluorescence under ultraviolet light. The image does not fluoresce. Any pressure-based contact would have produced lateral distortion. The image shows none. Every classical mechanism fails. The problem becomes even more severe when one considers resolution. The shroud image contains details down to the level of individual scourge marks, each only a few millimeters wide, consistent with the Roman flag. Yet the image also maintains coherence across the entire body, from head to feet, without blurring or overlap. No known medieval technique could produce such uniformity across a three-dimensional human form. Attempts have been made to recreate the image using artistic skill combined with clever engineering. Some have used bas-relief sculptures dusted with pigment. Others have attempted scorching techniques or photographic-like exposures. While these experiments can produce images that superficially resemble the shroud, they always fail under microscopic analysis. They penetrate fibers too deeply. They lack three-dimensional encoding. They produce residues. They degrade differently over time. None survive the same battery of tests that the shroud has endured. One of the most persistent explanations proposed involves contact with the body and the diffusion of gases produced during decomposition. This theory suggests that amines released by a decaying corpse could react with carbohydrates in the linen through a Maillard reaction, producing discoloration. At first glance, the idea seems plausible, but it collapses when confronted with the evidence. Decomposition gases do not respect anatomical boundaries. They diffuse unpredictably. They would blur features, distort proportions, and produce gradients inconsistent with the precise image observed. More importantly, decomposition takes time. The shroud image shows no signs of putrefaction. The bloodstains remain crisp and undisturbed. The cloth was not saturated with bodily fluids. Whatever formed the image occurred before decomposition began. There is also the matter of image directionality. Gas diffusion would affect the cloth unevenly depending on folds, contact points, and airflow. Yet the shroud image is remarkably uniform. The front and back images align anatomically. There is no image on the sides of the body where the cloth would have wrapped. This suggests a vertical interaction, not a radial or enveloping one. The idea that the image formed through simple contact also fails. If the cloth had been pressed against the body, areas of highest pressure, such as the nose, brow, and knees, would be darkest. While the nose is indeed prominent, the overall image darkness correlates with distance, not pressure. This is the opposite of what contact would produce. It is what a radiation-based interaction would produce. This is where the discussion enters uncomfortable territory. Radiation is not a word scientists invoke lightly, especially in historical contexts. Yet the properties of the image increasingly point in that direction. The image intensity appears to be a function of distance between the cloth and the body surface. Areas closer to the body are darker. Areas farther away are lighter. Beyond a certain distance, no image forms at all. This implies a collimated directional process, one that diminished with distance. It also implies that the body did not physically contact the cloth in most areas. Instead, something passed between them, carrying information from the body to the linen. What kind of radiation could do this? It would need to be extremely short-lived, spatially encoded, and capable of modifying cellulose without destroying it. It would need to act uniformly across the entire body surface in a single event. It would need to produce a superficial chemical change without thermal damage. No known natural radiation source associated with a corpse meets these criteria. Some researchers have proposed ultraviolet radiation of extremely high intensity. Laboratory experiments have shown that excimer lasers emitting ultraviolet light can produce discoloration on linen fibers that mimic certain aspects of the shroud image. However, these experiments require energy levels far beyond any known biological process. The amount of energy required to irradiate a human-sized area instantaneously would be enormous. This raises another disturbing implication. If ultraviolet radiation was involved, it would have had to originate from the body itself, not from the environment, not from the cloth, from the body. This is not a claim science can verify, but it is a logical inference from the data. It is important to be precise here. No scientific paper claims that a miracle occurred. What the data suggests is that the image formation mechanism is unknown and does not correspond to any known natural process associated with death, decay, or art. Science has reached the edge of its explanatory framework. Another overlooked aspect is the absence of directionality. Shadows, If light or radiation had been projected from a single point, shadows would appear. They do not. The image appears to have been formed by radiation emitted orthogonally from every point on the body's surface simultaneously. This would require a uniform emission across the entire body, occurring in a fraction of a second. This also explains why the image lacks motion blur. A process occurring over minutes or hours would have been disrupted by even the slightest movement, yet the image is sharply defined. The process must have been instantaneous. The bloodstains tell the same story. Blood on the shroud shows clear signs of having clotted on the body before transfer to the cloth. Serum halos visible under ultraviolet light indicate separation consistent with real wounds. The blood appears to have transferred by direct contact, but the image did not. This means two different processes occurred at two different times. First, the blood contacted the cloth. Later, the image formed without disturbing the blood. This sequencing is critical. Any contact-based explanation would necessarily disturb the bloodstains during image formation. That did not happen. This separation in time also challenges artistic explanations. And artists would need to place blood accurately first, allow it to dry, and then somehow create an image around it without touching it, without adding pigment, without heat, without pressure, and without leaving residues. The sheer improbability of such a scenario borders on the absurd. The image also contains information invisible to the naked eye. Ultraviolet fluorescence imaging reveals that the image areas do not fluoresce like scorched or chemically treated linen. Infrared analysis shows no added substances. X-ray fluorescence finds no pigments. These are not ambiguous results. They are consistent across decades of testing. One might argue that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but in this case, the absence itself is patent. It is systematic. It is meaningful. It points to a process that altered the linen itself, not something applied to it. This brings us to the most uncomfortable conclusion for both skeptics and believers. The shroud image is not easily explained by fraud, nor is it easily explained by miracle. It exists in a liminal space where data accumulates without resolution. For skeptics, this is frustrating because it resists debunking. For believers, it is unsettling because it resists simplification. The cloth does not proclaim its origin. It does not authenticate itself. It merely presents its evidence and remains silent. As technology advances, researchers hope that new methods may shed light on the process, yet there is a paradox here. The more we understand about image formation, radiation physics, and textile chemistry, the more anomalous the shroud becomes. It does not shrink into explanation. It expands. This is why the claim that the shroud was simply painted is no longer taken seriously in serious scientific discourse. That hypothesis died not because of ideology, but because of evidence. Too much of it. The image behaves like a photograph without a camera, a radiation imprint without a source, a chemical reaction without It records a human body without touching it, maps depth without measuring it, and ages fibers without time. Whatever one believes about its origin, the shroud forces a confrontation with the limits of explanation. It challenges the assumption that every artifact must fit neatly into known categories. It invites a different kind of inquiry, one that values humility as much as analysis. The cloth does not answer questions, it provokes them. And perhaps that is why, after centuries of scrutiny, debate, and controversy, the simplest statement about the shroud remains the most accurate. The image is real. It is not painted, and we do not know how it was made. That uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is a reminder of what science is meant to do, to follow the evidence where it leads, even when it leads into darkness. And as we move deeper into this mystery, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the image was formed by an instantaneous, energy-based process, what event could possibly account for it? That is the question waiting at the center of this cloth. If the image on the Shroud of Turin cannot be explained by art or known physics, the next logical question is whether it aligns with what we know of history. Objects can be anomalous and still be anachronistic. Many clever forgeries fail not because of chemistry, but because they reflect the assumptions of the era that produced them. This is where the shroud presents another problem. Its details do not reflect medieval imagination. They reflect a world the Middle Ages had largely misunderstood. Nails are placed through the palms. Despite the fact that such placement would not support body weight, blood flows in stylized patterns. Bodies appear idealized, with limited signs of trauma. Roman execution methods were not well understood in medieval Europe, and artists filled the gaps with theology rather than forensics. The shroud does not follow these conventions. The wrist wounds on the shroud are anatomically precise. They align with the space between the carpal bones, an area capable of supporting a suspended body. This detail was unknown until modern anatomical studies confirmed it. Only later did anatomy confirm that the wrist placement was not only plausible but necessary. The scourge marks are equally precise. They match the shape and spacing of a Roman flagrum, a whip fitted with multiple leather strands, tipped with metal or bone. Each strike produces a distinctive dumbbell-shaped wound. The shroud shows hundreds of these marks, distributed across the back, shoulders, chest, and legs. The pattern suggests a professional Roman scourging, not symbolic suffering. Even more telling is the absence of broken legs. Roman crucifixion often ended with crucifixion, the breaking of the legs to hasten death. The shroud shows no such trauma. This detail aligns with specific historical accounts but would have been an odd omission for a medieval artist attempting to heighten drama. The wound in the side is also consistent with Roman execution practices. It appears to have been inflicted after death, evidenced by the separation of blood and serum. The angle suggests a spear thrust upward into the thoracic cavity, consistent with a soldier confirming death. Medieval depictions often stylize this wound. The shroud presents it clinically. Then there is the head. Rather than a neat circlet, the puncture wound suggests a cap-like object pressed onto the scalp, consistent with a crown of thorns woven roughly and forced down. Blood flows in multiple directions, following gravity as the head moves. This is not artistic symbolism. It is fluid dynamics. The face itself tells another story. Swelling around the cheeks, a broken or bruised nose, abrasions consistent with blows. Jewish burial practices of the 1st century did not involve cosmetic restoration. Bodies were buried as they were, out of reverence and urgency. Medieval artists, by contrast, often softened features, even in depictions of suffering. The shroud does not soften anything. The burial cloth itself is consistent with Jewish customs of the time. Linen was used, not wool, in accordance with purity laws. The weave is a herringbone twill, rare but known in antiquity. There is no evidence of wrapping with spices mixed into the cloth which would have stained the image. Instead, the body appears to have been placed in the cloth and then removed relatively quickly. This timing matters. Jewish burial practices involved temporary entombment followed by later ossuary burial once decomposition was complete. The shroud image shows no signs of decomposition, suggesting the body was removed within a short window. This aligns with specific historical narratives but conflicts with the idea of a prolonged burial necessary for gas diffusion theories. Another overlooked detail is the positioning of the body. The hands are crossed modestly over the pelvis, a posture consistent with Jewish burial norms but not with medieval artistic convention. The thumbs are not visible, likely retracted due to nerve damage from crucifixion. This neurological detail was not understood in the Middle Ages. It was not depicted in art, yet it appears on the shroud. The feet show signs of a single nail driven through both, with one foot placed over the other. This method was used in some Roman executions but was not commonly depicted in medieval art, which often showed two nails. Again, the shroud aligns with archaeology, not iconography. One must also consider what is absent. There are no symbols, no halos, no inscriptions, no attempt to identify the figure. Medieval relics were rarely anonymous. They were labeled, narrated, contextualized. The shroud offers nothing. It presents a body without commentary, without embellishment. This silence is historically strange. If a medieval forger had created the shroud, the motivation would likely have been devotion or profit. In either case, clarity would have served better than ambiguity. A clear face, vivid colors, identifiable wounds, and overt symbolism would have enhanced veneration. Instead, the image is faint, easily overlooked, and confusing without modern enhancement. This is not how forgeries are made. Historical references to burial cloths bearing images do exist before the Middle Ages. Early Christian writings mention a mysterious image not made by human hands, described as ashrapoitos. These accounts are vague, but they suggest that the idea of a non-artificial image was present long before medieval Europe had the means to fabricate one convincingly. There is also the question of continuity. The shroud appears in historical records in Europe in the 14th century, but its sudden appearance does not necessarily imply creation. Many artifacts enter records long after their origin. Wars, migrations, and iconoclasm erase trails. Constantinople, a known repository of relics, was sacked in 1204. Many objects vanished into the shadows of history. Descriptions of a burial cloth bearing a full body image surface sporadically across centuries, often under different names. Whether these references point to the same object is debated, but the descriptions are strikingly consistent. A cloth with an image, not made by paint, revered yet hidden. The medieval church itself was cautious about the shroud. Bishops questioned it. Investigations were ordered. This is not the behavior one would expect if the church had commissioned or endorsed a forgery. Skepticism existed from the beginning, and yet the cloth was not condemned. It was studied, debated, and preserved. What complicates matters further is that the shroud does not reflect medieval theology perfectly. The suffering is intense, but restrained. There is no triumphalism, no resurrection imagery, no angels. The image captures death, not victory. Medieval devotion often emphasized glory. The shroud emphasizes finality. This raises a deeply uncomfortable possibility. The image may reflect a moment that theology struggles to depict, a transition rather than a conclusion, something between death and absence. From a purely historical standpoint, the shroud fits awkwardly everywhere. Too accurate for medieval art, too silent for propaganda, too detailed for symbolism, too ambiguous for devotion alone. This is why historians, even skeptical ones, increasingly avoid absolute claims. The shroud resists classification. It does not behave like a relic invented to inspire faith, nor does it behave like a hoax meant to deceive. It behaves like a document, one that records something without explaining it. Documents can be misunderstood, they can be misused. but they are not usually invented without purpose, and the purpose here remains elusive. The man on the cloth is not named, yet his injuries align with specific historical narratives associated with Jesus Christ. This alignment does not prove identity. Science cannot do that, but the convergence is statistically remarkable. Every major injury described aligns. No extra wounds appear. No expected wounds are missing. Skeptics often argue that the image was designed to match gospel accounts, but this argument assumes knowledge medieval artists did not possess. It assumes access to forensic understanding that only emerged in modern times. It assumes an intention to create ambiguity rather than clarity. Each assumption strains credibility. It is entirely reasonable to remain agnostic about the shroud's origin, but it is no longer reasonable to dismiss it as painted cloth. That debate belongs to the past. What remains is a far more difficult question. How did an object come to exist that aligns simultaneously with first-century execution practices, advanced image encoding, and material properties unknown until modern science? History offers no easy answers, but it does offer a warning. When an object refuses to fit the expectations of its supposed era, it may not belong to that era at all. The shroud does not shout its age. It does not demand belief. It simply endures, and in doing so it forces each generation to confront its own assumptions about knowledge, certainty, and the limits of explanation. As we approach the final stage of this inquiry, the mystery tightens. If the image is not art, not decay, not contact, not symbol, and not anachronism, then what remains? The final block will not offer closure, but it will confront the implications of everything we have seen so far. At this point, the question surrounding the Shroud of Turin can no longer be framed as whether it was painted. That question has already collapsed under the weight of evidence. What remains is far more unsettling, because it cannot be resolved with a single explanation, nor dismissed with a single objection. The shroud stands as a convergence of unanswered questions, each pointing toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. Something happened, and we do not fully understand what it was. Modern culture is deeply uncomfortable with this kind of uncertainty. We are trained to expect closure, to demand conclusions, to believe that with enough data, every mystery will yield. But the shroud does not behave like an ordinary mystery. It does not shrink as it is examined. It grows more complex. Each answer generates new questions, and each new question pushes against the boundaries of what science is prepared to explain. This does not mean that science has failed. On the contrary, science has done exactly what it is meant to do. It has tested hypotheses. It has eliminated false explanations. It has described the properties of the object with increasing precision. What it has not done is explain the cause, and that distinction matters. Too often the absence of explanation is confused with the absence of reality. But history is filled with phenomena that were observed long before they were understood. Electricity existed before it was named. Germs killed long before they were seen. Gravity shaped the cosmos before equations described it. Ignorance of mechanism did not negate existence. The shroud exists in that same category. It is an artifact whose properties are measurable, repeatable, and documented. The linen fibers are real. The blood is real. The image is real. What remains unknown is the process that united them. This is why the shroud occupies such a dangerous position in public discourse. For some it threatens skepticism. For others it threatens faith. Skeptics fear that admitting mystery opens the door to superstition. Believers fear that admitting uncertainty weakens conviction. Yet neither fear is justified. Mystery is not the enemy of reason, nor is it the enemy of belief. It is the boundary where both must slow down. What the shroud forces us to confront is not a conclusion, but a limit to how much can be inferred from material evidence alone. A limit to how confidently we can reconstruct the past, a limit to our assumptions about what is possible. Consider the image once more. It is not decorative, it is not dramatic, it does not try to persuade, it is faint, almost reluctant. Many have overlooked it entirely until photography revealed its depth. This subtlety is profoundly important. If the image were bold, colorful, or obvious, it would invite easy explanations. Its restraint denies that comfort. The image does not compel belief, it invites attention. Even its silence is instructive. The shroud does not claim identity. It does not announce itself as sacred. It does not declare its origin. Every interpretation is imposed by the observer. This is why debates surrounding it are so intense. People do not merely study the shroud, they project onto it. Some see confirmation of faith. Others see a challenge to dogma. Others see a puzzle that should not exist. In truth, the shroud accommodates all these reactions because it resolves none of them. It reflects back the assumptions of the viewer. This is perhaps its most unsettling quality. It does not force belief, it forces humility. If the image were proven definitively to be medieval, some would feel vindicated. If it were proven definitively to be first century, others would feel confirmed. But the current state of evidence allows neither victory. It leaves us suspended between explanations, unable to collapse the wave function, so to speak, into certainty. That suspension is deeply uncomfortable. It is far easier to reject the object entirely than to live with ambiguity. This is why simplistic dismissals persist despite decades of data. It's just a painting is emotionally satisfying. It restores order, it closes the door, but closed doors do not advance understanding. They merely protect assumptions. There is another layer to this discomfort, one rarely acknowledged. The shroud challenges the idea that meaning must always be intentional. We are accustomed to artifacts that are made to communicate something, messages, symbols, narratives. The shroud does not communicate in that way. It records, it documents, it preserves an event without commentary. This is closer to a forensic artifact than a religious icon. It resembles evidence more than proclamation. And evidence without interpretation is deeply unsettling, because it demands responsibility from the observer. What are we to do with an object that refuses to tell us what it means? For centuries, humans have struggled with that question in other contexts. Cave paintings, fossils, ancient ruins. Each generation reinterprets them through its own lens. The shroud is no different, except that it intersects with living belief systems rather than extinct ones. The image aligns closely with the historical accounts associated with Jesus Christ, yet alignment is not proof. Science does not operate on identity claims. It operates on correspondence. And the correspondence here is precise, unsettlingly so. Yet even if one accepts that correspondence, the image formation remains unexplained. And that is where belief, disbelief, and uncertainty collide. Some argue that invoking extraordinary events violates scientific rigor. But science does not forbid extraordinary events. It forbids unsupported claims. When evidence points to something unknown, the honest response is not denial, but acknowledgement. Others argue that mystery should strengthen faith. But faith built on mystery alone is fragile. The shroud does not offer faith, it offers data. What one does with that data is a personal matter. Perhaps the most reasonable position is neither belief nor disbelief, but patience. Patience to admit what we do not know. Patience to resist premature conclusions. Patience to allow the evidence to exist without forcing it into a narrative. In a culture obsessed with certainty, patience is revolutionary. The shroud has survived fires, wars, revolutions, and ridicule. It has outlasted scientific paradigms and theological disputes. It remains quietly unchanged, while interpretations rise and fall around it. That endurance alone deserves respect, not reverence. Respect, because respect allows investigation without fear, and fear has always been the enemy of understanding. Whether future technology will unlock the mechanism behind the image remains unknown. It may, or it may reveal deeper layers of complexity. Either outcome is acceptable. What matters is that the question remains open. The shroud does not demand an answer today. It has waited centuries, it can wait longer. But it does demand honesty. Honesty about what the evidence says. Honesty about what it does not say. Honesty about the limits of our explanations. In the end, the most accurate statement we can make about the Shroud of Turin is also the simplest. The image was not painted, it was not drawn, it was not created by any known artistic or natural process. It exists, it can be studied, and it remains unexplained. That may be unsatisfying, but it is also rare. In a world where answers are cheap and certainty is often performative, an unresolved question grounded in evidence is a gift. It reminds us that not everything important can be reduced to slogans or solved on demand. The shroud stands not as proof, not as refutation, but as a boundary marker, a reminder that reality is sometimes stranger than our categories allow. And perhaps the most profound lesson it offers is this, that the pursuit of truth does not always end with clarity, but it should always begin with humility. The image remains on the cloth, faint, silent, waiting, and so does the question.